all we have is that big word. We don't have a lot more detail beyond that.
Are they referring to the United States have also abandoned in entirety their nuclear arsenals?
North Korea's not talking about just North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons. They're saying we want the entire peninsula nuclear-free.
I hope that President Trump will go into this summit, on the one hand, insisting that the North clarify what they mean by their pledge to denuclearize.
U.S. Pacific Commander Admiral Harry Harris is being considered as the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea.
A little bit of a warning to North Korea.
One way of maintaining maximum pressure, even while they're reaching out.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello, I'm Eun-jung Cho at the VOA headquarters. Welcome to this special edition of Washington Talk on the Inter-Korean Summit. Leaders from South and North Korea agreed to work toward denuclearizing the peninsula and formally ending the Korean War. The historic meeting was filled with friendly gestures, but how much substance was achieved?
완전한 대화를 통해 핵 없는 한반도를 실현하는 것이 우리의 공동 목표라는 것을 확인했습니다.
하나의 문화를 가진 국가남은 원래대로 하나가 되어 민족만대의 끝없는 번영을 누리게 될 것입니다.
We seek a future of peace, prosperity, and harmony for the whole Korean peninsula. The United States in the past was played like a fiddle, money going in and nobody knew what was happening.
My guest today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also joining us today, Ms. Jean Lee, director of the Korea program at the Wilson Center. Ms. Lee is an award-winning journalist and the first Pyongyang bureau chief for the Associated Press. Welcome to both of you.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Jean. Let me begin with you. The three-page Panmunjom Declaration is full of big words like peace and ending the war and denuclearization. But when it comes to denuclearization, has there been meaningful progress?
That is the big word, and we need to focus on that one because that is the word that is different this time around from the two previous declarations, from the two previous summits. But that's all we have is that big word. We don't have a lot more detail beyond that. And I think what we'll have to do is see what happens from this point forward and also what happens at that anticipated summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un.
Frank, so the declaration says the two Koreas confirmed the common goal of nuclear-free Korean peninsula through complete denuclearization. But is North Korea going backward in terms of its commitment to denuclearization because its latest unilateral announcement was much more than this?
Well, I think you make a good point, Yoon-jung. North Korea has, on the one hand, agreed to the top line that meets the minimum requirement of the Trump administration. They have said that they want to live on a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. But they've left a lot out of that pledge. And I think there's going to be an enormous task ahead for President Trump and the U.S. government as they attempt to nail down exactly what the North Koreans mean when they talk about this nuclear-free peninsula. Are they referring to a nuclear-free world in which the United States and all other nuclear powers have also abandoned in entirety their nuclear arsenals? What about the future of nuclear power on the Korean peninsula? So a lot of details do remain to be worked out, but I'm cautiously optimistic that this pledge for peace and denuclearization combined with the small ball approach, the small but meaningful steps that were taken at the summit to reduce tensions and improve communication between the South and the North, I'm cautiously optimistic that this may actually set the stage for a very fruitful Trump-Kim meeting.
I think we need to look at what that means, a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula, because I think that that's going to be key here. we're not talking, or I should say North Korea is not talking about just North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons. They're saying we want the entire peninsula nuclear-free. South Korea does not have nuclear weapons. It is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. However, the United States, which does not have to sign on to that, has the capability in the region and has the capability of introducing nuclear weapons into South Korea. And so I think North Korea is looking at that nuclear umbrella, and that is what they refer to when they say a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula.
Well, it may be, but of course we won't know until we sit down. And for the moment, I think that the United States has shown admirable restraint in essentially saying to the North Koreans, look, we're prepared to listen to you. We're prepared to listen to your concerns about the American security posture. And the United States even took the extraordinary measure of not sending B-52 and B-2 bombers to participate in the annual spring exercises this year. I think that's a signal to the North Koreans that their concerns are going to be addressed in the context of an overall peace and denuclearization deal.
Jean, the Panmunjom Declaration is heavy on peace and improving inter-Korean ties, but not much on denuclearization. Why do you think is that?
That's something we need to pay attention to. That piece about denuclearization is toward the end of this declaration rather than at the beginning of it. So it perhaps has lost some emphasis than was originally intended by President Moon. But this is also the trickiest part of the equation.
There may be a simpler explanation.
Okay.
I was not worried that the denuke part was on number 3 or number 4 on the list of to-dos in the North-South summit. I think it's because North Korea believes that this is an issue that fundamentally has to be negotiated with the United States. They don't perceive that kind of a nuclear security threat emanating from the South. They believe it's a topic that really should be discussed between Pyongyang and Washington, D.C. So I was satisfied that it's in the summit joint declaration. And I think we sometimes overlook the fact that there was at least a joint statement. Previous deals that have fallen apart, like the 2012 Leap Day agreement, there was no agreement because there was no joint statement from the two parties flowing out of that meeting. So at least here we've got words on paper that we can now benchmark and hold the North accountable.
Jun, the two Koreas are talking of discussing with the United States and China to change armistice into the peace treaty. What should be the sequence of denuclearization and peace treaty? How should we arrange the sequence?
Denuclearization will be part of the discussion of a peace treaty. This is something that the leaders may have discussed, but this is something ultimately that North Korea needs to discuss with the United States and include China as well, because they are a signatory to the armistice. I think that we are going into this in such a different fashion than we might have expected, because the President of the United States is approaching this very differently than presidents past may have approached it. So what I say the steps should be may be very different than the way they're going to play out. We're going to be going into this summit backward from precedent, and so it's going to be very different.
Frank, so can we make advancements in the peace treaty even before North Korea makes substantial denuclearization moves?
Look, I think the phasing of this will be critical. The phasing of the 1994 agreed framework, which also envisioned verifiable denuclearization in exchange for peace and light water reactors, the phasing of it was done in a way to reserve the final steps for the very end. There would be no final peace and no final removal of all of their nuclear stockpile of fissile material until the very last step. What's different this time around is that North Korea already is a nuclear weapons state. And the United States and the international community are demanding some front loading of the steps toward removing those weapons, removing that threat. And for its part, the North wants to backload all of those critical steps to rid their nuclear weapons from the peninsula and front load all the benefits, the peace, the sanctions relief, the economic support. So that's going to be the essence of this negotiation, is going to be trying to find a reasonable compromise that can accommodate the demands of the international community, as well as the interests and the security expectations of the North Korean state. And it won't be easy.
Jean, regarding economic cooperation, the declaration mentions about reconnecting the roads and railways. Would the two Koreas seek to open up more economic cooperation starting with this? And is this even possible under the current sanctions regime?
What's interesting about this summit compared to the two previous summits is that there wasn't this emphasis on economic cooperation. When I looked at that delegation list, we didn't see anyone who was an economic expert on the South Korean side, which tells us that they had other issues that they wanted to prioritize. However, if you talk about engagement and reconciliation, the economic part of it is essential. And so it's not surprising that it's in there. However, it is a very different situation now than 11 years ago because of the sanctions that have been imposed, both by South Korea following the Cheonan sinking in 2010, and also, of course, by the United Nations. And so that makes that discussion very complicated. And I think that the South Korean side was very careful in broaching that and including it in the declaration, because what they don't want is to weaken that their commitment to this campaign of maximum pressure, and that is partly because they need to manage the relationship with the United States as well. And so I think that's why we saw some mention of it in some minute form.
I do want to move on to another question.
Okay.
President Trump has cautiously welcomed the deal, and although he also said that he does not want to repeat past mistakes, that in the past the U.S. was played like a fiddle. Now, Frank, based upon the results of the Inter-Korean summit, how should the U.S. strategize going into the summit with Kim Jong-un?
Well, I'm struck by the modesty of the North-South summit. In comparison to the somewhat grandiose ambition, I think, that President Trump has for his meeting with Kim Jong-un. I think he really hopes to get not just an ironclad commitment out of the North to abandon all of their nuclear weapons, but really rapid action toward that objective. And I think at the end of the day, that may be unrealistic. I hope that President Trump will go into this summit, on the one hand, insisting that the North clarify what they mean by their pledge to denuclearize, but at the same time being realistic about what it's going to take even to catalog what we're talking about. We don't know where all the facilities are. We don't know how many weapons they have. We don't know how many missiles they have. We don't know how many centrifuges they have producing highly enriched uranium. Just making a verifiable list of what needs to then be removed is going to take weeks or months or God forbid, years. So I hope that President Trump enters into this summit meeting with a dose of realism.
Right. We'll end this conversation here and move on to our next segment.
So I'll continue to provide military options to President Trump and Secretary Mattis while doing everything possible to emphasize our desire for peaceful denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula.
U.S. Pacific Commander Admiral Harry Harris is being considered as the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea. Admiral Harris was initially tapped as the next ambassador to Australia, but the Trump administration now considers posting him to South Korea instead. Admiral Harris previously said North Korea is the biggest threat to Asia and that U.S. must go into a summit with Kim Jong-un with eyes wide open. Now, Frank, Admiral Harris, high-ranking military official, being considered as U.S. ambassador to South Korea, what is the message to North Korea?
Well, I've met Admiral Harris. He's an extraordinarily capable flag officer of the U.S. Navy. but he's also a skilled diplomat in his own way. That job of being commander of the Pacific Fleet comes with a lot of diplomacy duties as well. So I think that one of the messages that President Trump may be sending, one is that he likes military men. He finds them decisive. He has surrounded himself with a lot of them, including his Secretary of State. Second message is that the challenge on the peninsula is, for the U.S., principally a security challenge, and he wants an ambassador who understands the reality of that very clearly. And I think the third message is a little bit of a warning to North Korea. We're sending an ambassador who is under no illusions about the North Korean intentions or capabilities, and who's going to work closely with the South Korean government to make sure that they understand that as well. So I think it's an interesting choice, probably a wise choice. Personally, I wish there were a few more civilians in general in senior positions in the Trump administration, but for this job at this time, I think Admiral Harris is a good choice.
Jean, this comes at a time when Trump administration is trying out diplomacy with North Korea, yet key posts are filled with those who made hardline comments on North Korea. How should we interpret this?
This is perhaps one way of maintaining maximum pressure, even while they're reaching out. But I think the bottom line here is that he feels, as Frank mentioned, comfortable with military figures. He listens to military figures. Whoever is in that position as ambassador is going to be most effective if they have a good connection with President Trump. And so that's what's important. Is it somebody he listens to? Is it somebody whose judgment he trusts? That connection is probably what's most important right now.
Frank, Admiral Harris has extensive experience not only on the Korean Peninsula, but also Japan and China. So if he actually is sent out to South Korea, then what would be the impact to the overall policy on Northeast Asia?
Yoon-jung, you raise a really critical point here, because coordination with our allies as well as with China will be absolutely essential. China has to be a part of any peace agreement. The Japanese have huge equities at stake on the peninsula, and indeed, U.S. forces in Japan are aligned partly to the task of defending Korea against North Korean attacks. So Admiral Harris is known to all of the regional players and trusted by them. So I think this gives him an immediate advantage to hit the ground running as our senior diplomat in Seoul. He's not going to need to introduce himself to Beijing. They already know him very well, and they know the measure of him. They know that he's tough, that he means what he says, that he's going to enforce international norms and rules. I think these will be great assets that he brings to the job.
Jean, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo reportedly wanted Admiral Harris as the U.S. ambassador to South Korea, and this was even before his Senate confirmation. So does this show the urgency of the Korea issues for the Trump administration?
You know, President Trump said earlier today, we won't be played like a fiddle. So does back that up by sending Admiral Harry Harris into that position. So, but it is important that we have somebody in that position at this juncture. It's going to be a long and difficult and complicated process if all goes well. And so we do need to have somebody who's coordinating policy and has the president's ear.
Frank, having Admiral Harris as the U.S. ambassador to South Korea, does it mean that if the talks falter, doesn't work out, then the Trump administration will go back considering the preventive strike against North Korea?
I think the Trump administration has never taken military action off the table. And I think that they do want an ambassador who is skillful about the logistics challenges, even of evacuating American citizens in the event of a looming crisis. That was one of the issues, apparently, that caused some concern with the previous ambassadorial choice, Victor Cha. I wouldn't read too much into that. I think that the head U.S. diplomat is not going to be the warfighter. That's U.S. Forces Korea's job. But having an officer who is familiar with the challenges of war and the difficult, almost desperately difficult challenge of trying to move 150,000 Americans off the peninsula, God forbid that there should come a conflict, probably gives the Trump administration some comfort that they've chosen the right guy for the job.
At least creates the impression that they have somebody who knows how to do all of that and would be on board with all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Frank, Jean, thank you for joining us.
Jung, thank you.
Thank you.
And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Thank you for watching.